Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was very excited to read Catarina's book because it seemed to draw together a lot of different things that I've been working on and thinking were quite separate, actually. And it had this sort of nice way of, at least for me, drawing together things that I hadn't realised were connected. So I'm going to talk a bit about this question. If Catarina were right about what she talks about in her book, what kind of empirical predictions would we make? And the claim I want to make is I think we, as perhaps a different research community, have already tested some of those predictions. And I'm going to try and give some examples of reinterpretation of some of the work I've done previously in light of Catarina's book. Now, obviously, I'm in a room full of, in the Lakatos building, talking at the Lakatos. So we've got to be a bit careful because Lakatos does make this big point, of course, that you shouldn't be so excited about new theories predicting old results. But on this occasion, I think I'm very confident that Catarina hadn't read all of my previous work, so I think we'll be okay. But I do think her account also makes some future predictions as well, which, if I've got time, we can perhaps, might get on to. I don't know if I'll have time for that. But that's my main aim, to say that this actually does have some empirical content, and let me try and convince you of that. So I'm going to focus on Catarina's work on this proof of skeptic dialogues that we've just heard a bit about. Very briefly, I don't know if everyone would have read the book, but basically this is the argument that deductive argument should be conceptualized as dialogue. Prover and skeptic talking to each other. Prover wants to establish the conclusion. Skeptic wants to block the conclusion too easily, by being established too easily. And the interesting and important point is this is a semi-adversarial dialogue, because Prover wants to convince skeptic and explain what's going on, and skeptic doesn't want to be doesn't want to be too annoying, doesn't want to use rhetorical tricks to stop Prover, but wants to really push to make sure that mistakes are not being made. Okay, so that's the key point. And at some point, skeptic has become internalized and universalized. So if you've got a good deductive argument, you want to try and it needs to be convincing and explanatory to the widest possible range of skeptics. Okay, sorry to whiz over this prize-winning book in 10 seconds. But this is the nice diagram from the book, and you can see that the argument goes something like this. We've got some thesis, and you can, if that wasn't there, you could see that skeptic grants some premises. No, sorry, skeptic is asked to grant some premises, and skeptic can either refuse to do that, or we can go into this inferential steps. And after each step, skeptic might want to ask why and push for extra clarification, or indeed offer some kind of local counterexample, and then or just say nothing and allow the next step to go on. And we have some iterative process until either the proof is abandoned or the conclusion is reached. Okay, so if that were right, what might we expect to see if you do empirical work on mathematical cognition, as I do? Okay, let me just motivate this by giving you some quotes from important people from the past. So one interesting policy question is, why should we encourage people to study mathematics? Mathematics has this privileged place on the school curriculum. And why is that, really? Well, one sort of classic answer to this is given by people like Plato or Locke, who argue that mathematics is really important because it develops logical reasoning skills. So here's Locke saying mathematics ought to be taught to all those who have the time and opportunity, not so much to make them mathematicians as to make them reasonable creatures. And here's a more modern person. This is Adrian Smith, who is, I think he's in charge of the Royal Society now, very, very overtly saying the main reason that we should make mathematical study, we should privilege it on the school curriculum, is because it disciplines the mind and develops logical and critical reasoning. Now, if you're an educational psychologist, the obvious question is, well, is this true? And indeed, there's a lot of, if you talk to your average educational psychologist, they will say, well, this is not true. We know this is not true. We've known that since Thorndike in the early 1900s. But maybe they're being a bit hasty. So some while ago, I set out to investigate this. Did a very series of studies on this problem.
Can you read that little box?
Yeah, is that possible? I don't know what that's saying. Okay, so I'm just going to give a few examples from the work I did on that project. So what would Catarina say about this? I think she would say something, if we forced her to make some empirical predictions. I think she would say something like this. Mathematical study exposes you to lots of deductive arguments of the form, this dialogical process that we've talked about. So if they are indeed internalized proof-of-skeptic dialogue, we would expect mathematicians to be really very good at playing the role of a skeptic when constructing reading or evaluating logical arguments. That ought to be part of the training that studying mathematics, the skill set that studying mathematics develops. And importantly, we don't want that only to be some kind of pre-existing difference. That ought to be at least partially developmental. So it shouldn't be the case that mathematicians are just really good at this and that's why they study mathematics. It ought to be the case that if you go and study mathematics, at least to some extent, you'll develop this skill because you're seeing a lot of these deductive arguments. Okay, so how can you study this? Well, there's various different ways you can study this. This guy is a really cool psychologist from the 1960s who developed a very famous reasoning task that many of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with. Peter Wason from up the road at UCL. And he developed this task, which, if you're not familiar with, I won't give you time to try and solve. But essentially, it's a task about how people interpret conditional statements. So you've got these 4 cards, and you have this rule. Each card has a letter on one side and a number on the other. And you have this rule: if D, then 3. If a card has a D on one side, then it has a 3 on the other, and you've got to decide which to turn over. Now, the fun thing about this task is, famously, people find it really hard and typically get it wrong. So the traditional wrong answer is to say you need to turn over the D and the 3. And this has puzzled cognitive psychologists for, well, when I started working on this, I would have said 40 years, but now I have to say 60 years. No, something like that, a long time anyway. Why do people get it wrong so much? For those of you who aren't familiar, the correct answer is to turn over the D and the 7. It's such the normative answer. Some people argue that's not the correct answer for evolutionary reasons we won't get into. But you need to check whether there's a 3 on the back of the D, and you need to check whether there's a D on the back of the 7. And it doesn't matter what's on the back of the 3, because if it's a D, that's okay, and if it's not a D, that's also okay. Okay, so why do people get this wrong? Well, the classic account, a classic account, I should say, is that the presence of these 2 figures in the rule biases your attention in some kind of Kahneman and Tversky system 1, system 2 way. So you're only looking at the D and the 3. You're only considering the D and the 3, and you kind of rationalize this, and you sort of say, okay, I see why you need the D. Got to be a 3. I see why I need the 3. It might be a D, and then that's the answer you give. So that's the sort of standard account. It's a sort of attentional bias account coupled with rationalizing those biases. Okay, so some while ago, I just sort of thought it'd be fun to see what happens if you get mathematicians to answer this question. This was, so we just did this big internet study where we just got a load of maths undergraduates and research active academics and PhD students, and compared their responses with some history undergraduates. It was kind of interesting. So this was the history students' responses. So classically, only 6% of people got the answer right. That's about normal. And most people, this is normally the other way around, so this is slightly weird, but normally most people would say D and 3, and some slightly smaller group of people would say D. But okay, so what happens if you ask mathematicians to do this? So they do a little bit better. So, you know, a non-trivially higher proportion of people are getting it right, but not many. But what's really kind of interesting about this, I think, is that they're getting it wrong in quite different ways. So they're much less likely to give the standard, in inverted commas, answer, and much more likely to answer just D. Well, not much more likely, but more likely in comparison to those two big wrong answers. And this is also true of researchers. This it might sound surprising. I don't think this is surprising given the account I'm about to offer. I think it fits quite nicely with Catarina's account. So what's going on here? You'd have thought these people are, super logical people. They should be much better at answering this. But I think this difference gives us a real clue as to what's going on. So, just to summarise those results. So mathematical samples have a different range of answers. They're more likely to select, slightly more likely to select the correct answer, and much less likely to select the standard mistake. And overall, if you collapse across cards, much less likely to select the 3 card. Okay, so if this dual process account is right, then mathematicians have the same attentional biases as everyone else, of course. There's no reason why they shouldn't. They're supposed to be fairly universal. Then their attention should also be directed to the D and the 3, but apparently they end up rejecting the 3 more commonly than the general population. And I think this is exactly what you would predict if mathematicians have particularly well-developed internal skeptics. So the internal skeptic doesn't help you find this 7 answer because you're not even attending to it at all. You're ignoring it completely because your attention has been biased towards these 2 cards mentioned in the rule, the system 1 type reasons. And what's nice about this is we should be able to detect this by studying the eye movements of participants as they solve this task. And if I was on my computer now, I would cleverly whiz this up and show you some videos, but because we're on here, I will just move over to the other screen and show you. So this is the eye movements of an art student. Oops. Here we go.
Double click in the middle.
Okay. And you can see, I think, the attentional bias here quite clearly. This person really spends almost no time looking at the 7 and the K, but spends almost all their time looking at the D and the 3, as this theory would predict. Their attention's been biased there, and they're rationalising why the D and the 3 is the correct answer. Okay. Now, so what happens what would we expect the mathematician eye movement video to look like? Oops. Well, it's very similar, although this person is giving the mathematician's answer of only selecting the D. But you can see again, their attention is biased towards only the D and the 3. But because they don't select the 3, something different's happening here, right? They're rejecting the 3. They're not rationalising it. But as you can see, then when it finishes there is when they click to select the answer. I think what's going on there, was past the videos, you can do that statistically, of course. This is the dwell time on non-rejected cards. So it's really clear here that mathematicians are rejecting the 3 card quite differently to how non-mathematicians are rejecting the 3 card. But they're rejecting the 7 card in a pretty similar way. And I think this fits really nicely with Catarina's account. That if you've got a well-developed internal skeptic, your skeptic is doing some work here to think about why the 3 is the wrong answer. It's not doing any work over here because that's just they're not attending to that in a cognitively deep manner. Okay. So more precisely, this bit here is going on in a way that doesn't seem to be happening quite as much with the general population sample. Looking for local counterexamples to inferential steps. Okay, so what about this question? It's no good just mathematicians being different to the general population. That would be boring. What we want to know is it developmental? So does studying mathematics, is that associated with this kind of change? So a while back, we did this study asking whether studying post-compulsory mathematics A-levels in a UK context, so 16 to 18-year-olds, is that associated with reasoning development? And if it is that development consistent with this in developing an internal skeptic? So I won't bore you too much with this, but this is a rather tedious task where you just ask people about abstract conditional statements and ask whether conclusions follow or not. And of course, you can imagine you can manipulate the presence of nots in such a statement, and you can ask about modus ponens and modus tollens, and you can also ask about denial of the antecedent and affirmation of the consequent. And if I was in a room full of psychologists, I would explain a lot about what this is, but I'm assuming this is very well taught in philosophy degrees, so I'm not going to say much about this. But the classic account, of course, the classic way of thinking about these things, of course, is that modus ponens and modus tollens are valid, and denial of the antecedent and affirmation of the consequent are invalid. Okay, so we did this study where we tracked A-level mathematics and A-level English literature students across a year of study, and we controlled for intelligence and a measure of thinking disposition, which I won't get into. One of the issues with this kind of study is you can't randomly allocate people into studying mathematics or not, which is a real pain. So you've got to sort of kind of mitigate that by doing lots of covariates. Anyway, so we had this test of abstract conditional inference. So what happened? Well, everyone endorses modus ponens. That's not so interesting. But the interesting bits are, this is up the axis here is the number of inferences endorsed. The reason it's traditional to plot it like that is because there has been this argument about whether modus tollens is actually valid from some evolutionary psychology perspective, which I don't want to get into, but this is just inference is endorsed. So the dark bars are the time 1 and the light bars are time 2. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, across a year of studying post-compulsory mathematics, mathematics students do seem to endorse denial of the antecedent less. And they do also seem to endorse affirmation of the consequent less. Whereas English literature students, there's no significant change. So that's nice. That is in line with Locke and Smith. Other people too. Rishi Sunak, I suppose. But interestingly, they also endorse modus tollens less. So there is this big drop in the proportion of modus tollens inferences that the mathematics students endorse at time 2 compared to time 1, whereas the literature group doesn't change. So this really isn't a simple mathematics. Studying mathematics is associated with getting more normative at logic. Something more interesting than that's going on. I should say this isn't something weird about the English UK curriculum. If you do the same study in Cyprus, which we did, there they have high intensity option for 16 to 18-year-olds and a low intensity option. You get more or less the same results. So you can see that they diverge, the two groups diverge on the number of inferences endorsed. This was across 2 years now. From denial of the antecedent and affirmation of the consequent, and this is less impressive difference for modus tollens, but certainly there's no divergence in the same way as there is for these invalid inferences. So, what's the summary of all of that? Well, there's this association between post-compulsory mathematics study and some change in conditional reasoning, but it's not straightforward. It's not just they're getting much more normative. It seems to be that they're getting better at rejecting invalid inferences, but somehow that skepticism somehow overgeneralizes, and they also end up rejecting modus tollens. And I think this really is a nice way of describing it, which is actually, this is a quote from a talk I did well before I read Catarina's book. And I hadn't really connected it with the other thing I'm going to talk about, but maybe one of the really interesting cognitive effects of studying mathematics is it does make you better at spotting flaws in arguments. But because it doesn't directly teach you that, you can kind of overgeneralize that skill to more complicated, cognitively more complicated deductions such as modus tollens. And I think that's more or less what Catarina's account would predict in this context. So it'd be interesting to hear other people's views on that when I finish. Okay, let me give you a second example, which is some work on how undergraduate students read mathematical proofs. So the background here is that reading undergraduates find it really helpful, right? There's tons of data that at least some undergraduate samples. You need to be really careful about talking about undergraduates because they vary a lot, of course. But let me be specific. Undergraduates from Tennessee State University and Loughborough sometimes don't perform better than chance if you give them a proof and ask them if it's valid or not. And we know also that they systematically read differently to research mathematicians. So they tend to pay much more attention to algebraic manipulation and much less attention to logical relationships if you do eye movement studies. So there's a problem here. Undergraduates find reading mathematical proofs quite difficult. So can we improve undergraduate proof comprehension? Well, let's think what Catarina would tell us to do if she were in charge of undergraduate pedagogy. I guess she would say that pedagogy which aims to improve the motivation or skills of the internal skeptic and the ability of the prover to respond to the skeptic is going to be really effective at improving proof comprehension. If these proofs are internalized prover-skeptic dialogues, then presumably to understand them, the goal is to recreate the original dialogue, much like we saw in the first talk, albeit in a proof construction situation. So maybe we should teach students to do that. So we need, in particular, this bit of the diagram. We need to design instruction that's going to help with that. And happily, there is a long tradition in educational psychology of doing exactly this in a more general, non-mathematical context, which is this technique called self-explanation, which is really very, very simple. It's just the technique of explaining things to yourself. And it turns out that this technique of explaining things to yourself is something that experts do across domains. So if you do a study of expert physicists and not expert physicists, one difference you find is the expert physicists devote a lot of effort to explain things to themselves when they're working, and the novices don't. So yeah, so there's an expert novice difference there, but also importantly, it can be trained. You can train people to explain things to themselves more. And some years ago, some colleagues and I adapted some material from biology into mathematics in an attempt to see whether self-explanation training would improve proof comprehension in mathematics. So what is it? Well, it uses written materials that firstly explains the benefits of doing this. So tells the reader that you ought to do this, it's going to help you understand more. Then says that a really key thing after each line in an undergraduate level proof is to identify the key ideas and explain each line in terms of the previous ideas or previous knowledge. So to use Catarina's language, this is saying to the reader, you've got to get your skeptic to ask why after each line in the proof until your prover can adequately respond. So this is really just to tell the reader to do this. It's pretty basic. It's not a big intervention. It demonstrates how to do this. These materials demonstrates how to do this with an example proof. And then I think this bit's quite important actually, which I'm not sure how this fits in with the framework, but distinguishes this kind of self-explanation from a kind of monitoring statement, which is of the form, I understand, or monitoring your own reading, or paraphrasing, which is just rewording the line in the proof. So recapitulating it in your own language, not adding any new information, which of course is not playing this skeptic prover game. And then it has a practice proof. Okay, so this is the kind of thing it looks like. It's really basic. It's a sort of 10-minute intervention that you can give to undergraduates before they read proofs. I won't let you read that. So the interesting question is this the case? Does self-explanation training lead to more effective proof reading? I'm going to tell you about two studies, one a lab study and then one a real-world lecture theatre study. So in the lab study, we had some undergraduates. We randomly assigned them to receive this training or not. The control group did some stuff about history. We had a proof about triadic primes. an interesting question you might be thinking is, well, how do you measure someone's proof comprehension? I'm not going to tell you the answer to that, but only that there is there's a body of research on how to do that. And we used the Rutgers group's technique. And yeah, so we split people to either receive the training or do something else. Then they read a proof. Then they explain the proof line by line, either using their training or just explain it please. And we recorded that. We asked them to think aloud as they did that and recorded it, and then coded their explanations. And then we gave them a comprehension test based on this Rutgers work. So there's different ways you can think about explanations in the literature. This is what we really care about. So principle-based explanations, which is what we would hope our provers would be responding to the skeptic. So explanations based on things not explicit in the proof. And it turns out this intervention does seem to have a big effect on the type of explanations that people give. So if you're a light grey person, you've received this training, you do about twice as many of these principle-based explanations, and you do a lot less of this negative and positive monitoring. So, I don't understand would be a negative monitoring, and the reverse for a positive. So it does seem to have an effect on the type of thing these people are thinking about. If you just tell them to do some of this, you tell them to engage in this prover-skeptic dialogue, they do more of it. And they also just have better proof comprehension outcomes. So this is the participants split by year group. Kind of interestingly, I think, the effect seems to get bigger with the more sophisticated the more experienced the students are, which I think is also something you would predict, because of course, people in the third year of their undergraduate studies would have more resources to draw on to construct these self-explanations. That's not something we really followed up on. I think that's kind of interesting. Like, what is the resources you need to do this dialogue beyond just being told to do it? Okay, well, that's a lab study with a slightly artificial think aloud situation, which I'm always a bit skeptical of. What if you just get people to do this in a lecture theatre? So this was a study we did with a first year analysis lecture. And again, we split the class into two. One group got the training, one group got some control activity. And then we got them to read a proof and do a comprehension test. And then simply because we had some spare time, we thought, well, let's see what happens. Does it last? So 20 days later, they did the same thing, but in reverse, to make sure, for ethical reasons, we wanted to make sure everyone got the training eventually. So it does seem to work in a genuine pedagogical setting, and slightly surprisingly to me, I was expecting this to wash out over the 20 days. So this difference between the two groups to be dissipated, and it wasn't really. So it seems that this can actually have quite a powerful effect on students' ability to comprehend proofs, simply telling them to engage in the kind of dialogue with themselves that Catarina is talking about. So that's the answer to that question. Yeah, so to, again, go back to Catarina's point, encouraging this internal skeptic seems to improve proof comprehension outcomes. We've also done various studies, again, tracking participants' eye movements. And it does more than just improving their outcomes. It makes them read slightly more like mathematicians, in the sense of tending more to the logical relationships between lines. But I won't go into that now. And if you're interested in following up on what that training looks like, you can get it from there. Okay, so have I got time to do my last? Maybe not. Have I got time?
We started a little bit late.
Okay. In that case, I will.
As long as you go through.
Okay. Okay, so there's two examples where I think this account nicely brings together two bits of work I've done in the past, which I really didn't really have much in common. So I was kind of excited about that, and then I started thinking, well, what future predictions might it make? Which obviously, as we know, are much more impressive. So I want to just briefly talk about this paper, which is a funny little thing I wrote, getting on for 10 years ago now, which has this finding that mathematicians, somewhat surprisingly to me, sometimes disagree about the validity of really very basic proofs. And interestingly, that's not just performance errors, because that disagreement is associated with their research area. So here is, if you can't read that, this is the integral of 1 over x. That's the theorem. Here's a slightly weird proof about that, which I won't get you to read. But you can ask people to read this proof and just say whether it's valid or not. And if you do this, you find that 27% of mathematicians or thereabouts say it's valid and 73% say it isn't. Which surprised me, because we're told that this is a very the sort of classic account is that mathematicians always agree with each other about this sort of thing. It turns out that there is a difference between pure and applied mathematicians, self-identifying pure mathematicians and self-identifying applied mathematicians. There's a difference in validity judgments there. And then if you point to a particular issue with this proof, which is this, so the author, this is a complaint you can make about this proof, that in the last line, the limit and the integral commute, which you can do in this context, but you can't do in general. And the proof doesn't justify why you can do it. You say, well, look, is this issue enough to render the proof invalid? It turns out that people's answer to that question is completely dependent on their original answer. So if they had originally said the proof was valid, that objection is rejected. That's not enough. And if they originally said it was invalid, most people think that objection is enough. And this sort of, again, I think that this is enough to convince me that this isn't just a performance error. This is a genuine disagreement about what counts as validity. And I sort of puzzled about this for ages and then forgot about it. So what does this dialogic account say about this? I think it says something like this. This kind of straightforward, is it valid or is it not valid? Or is it a killer objection or is it not a killer objection? Is really highly artificial, because in a real world situation, this dialogue would be continuing, this proof of skeptic dialogue. What we've done there is we've cut the dialogue off halfway through and forced a decision to be made. Whereas in a sort of review context or a real world mathematical context, apart from in education, of course, which is interesting, the dialogue would carry on and a resolution would be reached, and you wouldn't get this difference. So I think a strong prediction this dialogic account would make, that if you ran this study in a genuinely dialogic context, these apparent differences and disagreements ought to disappear. Now, if that's right, it does beg the question of whether these kind of is it valid questions should be appearing on exams if they're so weird and unusual. And I think it has various other interesting implications as well. But I haven't done that study, but someone ought to. Thank you.